current budget agreement negotiation going on that's yielding anything. So without a budget agreement, does the gentleman plan to at least provide and bring a budget to the House floor? And I yield back.
It is a very interesting question, Mr. Speaker, that the minority whip asked me. I would ask in response a question, does the minority whip remember when last year, when you were in charge, you brought the budget to the floor?
Yeah, if the gentleman yields back,
I yield to my friend for the answer.
I'll be happy to walk through the last 8 years.
No,
so
I
for
just
fiscal year 12,
I asked you a simple question, reclaiming my time. I asked you a simple question, Mr. Whip. You asked me about when the budget was coming. And I asked you, when did you bring the budget to the floor last year?
If the gentleman will yield.
I'll yield.
So last year, as the gentleman knows, we were working under a 2-year budget agreement. Typically, we don't have a 2-year budget agreement. You bring one budget, and that's the budget for that year. So for fiscal year 12, the House passed a budget. In our majority, we passed a budget to establish those numbers to then start the appropriations process. In 2013, we passed through the House a budget to establish the 2013 budget numbers to work off of. In 2014, we passed a budget through the House to establish the budget for that fiscal year. In 2015, we passed a budget through the House to establish the budget for that year. In 2016, we actually got an agreement both between the House and the Senate, passed the budget, of course, through the House and the Senate. Fiscal year 17, we passed a budget through the House and the Senate and got a full agreement to do an appropriations process. In fiscal year 2018, as the gentleman knows, we actually agreed to a 2-year budget agreement to not only set the fiscal year numbers for 1 year, but for 2 years, which was tremendously helpful in making sure that our nation's defense, which many times had been used as bargaining chips for other budget negotiations, we took that off the table. We made sure our men and women in uniform had the certainty of a 2-year budget agreement, which doesn't happen often. Frankly, it should happen more often, and we should strive towards that. So we achieved it. So in 2019, as the gentleman knows, we passed a budget out of the House Budget Committee, but we already had a budget agreement to work through the appropriations process because we had done a 2-year budget the prior year. We don't have even a 1-year budget agreement right now, and as the gentleman knows, there are no fruitful negotiations to get a 1 or 2-year budget agreement, so there's no budget number to work off of, which is why you produce a budget. And so last year we did bring a bill out of committee, but we didn't need to pass a budget because we already had the budget number agreed to from the 2-year deal prior. And so with that, is the gentleman willing to engage in or come to an agreement on at least a 1 or 2-year budget agreement so that we can actually have a appropriations process that works for the country and shows the priorities of this nation? And I yield back.
I appreciate, Mr. Speaker, a lot of words of the minority whip. He didn't pass the budget last year. There was no fiscal year 19 budget. He is correct that we had reached a caps deal. That is not the budget, Mr. Speaker. A budget is a plan that is reported out and brought to the floor and passed and sent to the Senate, and the Senate passes, and we have a budget that is in the same position on each side of the aisle. That's a budget. That has rarely been done in the last 8 years. A caps deal has been reached. I would like to see a caps deal reached. I've been talking to Mr. McConnell, who wants a caps deal reached. I've talked to Mr. Shelby, both of those Republican leaders. I've talked to the White House about a caps deal. Unfortunately, I don't think Mr. Mulvaney wants to reach a caps deal. He wants to use it as leverage as opposed to allowing us to proceed in the regular order. But a budget is a different kettle of fish, I will tell my friend, than a caps deal. The caps deal does in fact set the 302 level of discretionary funding for both defense and non-defense spending. Yes, we reached a 2-year cap deal. I've been trying for the last 2 months to get meaningful negotiations underway to do the same. I have not been successful. largely because the President, apparently, and Mr. Mulvaney are not interested in reaching such a deal. I regret that, but the Budget Committee is meeting this week. It met next week. It's going to meet next week, and we are going to be reporting out what will be what the Minority Whip refers to as a budget. It will certainly speak to the levels of funding that we need to spend, because I want to pass the appropriation bills by June 30th. That's never been done, but I want to do it. I think we can do it, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to work towards that objective. It will require reaching what numbers are going to be for discretionary spending. Unfortunately, the budget that the President of the United States sent down to the Congress is totally unreasonable and irrational. And there's not a single person, I think, on this floor who will support his budget. And I will tell the Minority Whip that I would be glad to give his party the opportunity to vote on the President's budget. If he asks me, I'll have it put on the floor. Mr. Speaker, it's unfortunate that we are not able to get to a budget caps deal. We passed, and again, in my view, an irrational, and I voted for it. I'm sorry that I voted for it. The Budget Control Act, creating the sequester. The sequester is a complicated word which starts with S, which I tell my people in my districts and town meetings stands for stupid. It was an irrational document that took numbers out of the air without regard to our responsibilities and our opportunities. But I am hopeful, and I tell the Republican whip, my friend, that we are going to try to, hopefully working with his party, establish some reasonable, rational numbers for defense and non-defense discretionary spending so that we can move ahead with doing what really makes the difference, and that is the adoption of appropriation bills on this floor, send them to the Senate and have the Senate consider them, and we'll have a conference or we'll pass those bills and send them to the President of the United States. And I yield back to my friend.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back, and I too am hopeful that we're able to start an appropriations process and ideally to complete it by summer, well in advance of the September 30th government funding deadline, because we shouldn't be operating under deadline after deadline where we go till the midnight hour. But as the gentleman knows, you can't start an appropriations process until you actually set what are known as the 302 numbers, the 302A and B numbers, so that we know what the bills, each appropriations bill can target in terms of their overall spending number to have that caps limit. Ideally, it would be done through a budget with the April 15th deadline, but maybe the gentleman's going to be able to work with the committee to get a budget passed out of committee before the deadline. But if not, as the gentleman urges hopeful desire to get a caps deal, I would like to get a caps deal as well. I supported the last caps deal because it gave us 2 years of certainty. It was bipartisan. It was an agreement that while we may disagree on top line numbers and we want more money for defense and some on your side might want more for non-defense discretionary, we finally came to an agreement. And that did give tremendous certainty to our men and women in uniform, and to over 70% of this federal government was fully funded for the fiscal year. Clearly, we had a difference on border security, and that remaining area of our budget wasn't funded, but at least for the 70+% of the people of this country who rely on those services and want a strong defense, we're able to see us achieve that, and hopefully we can do something like that again well before the deadline. That's the objective. Hopefully we can get there, and I'll be happy to yield.
I want the public, Mr. Speaker, to understand that a caps deal is not a budget. There are two separate items. A budget is a plan for expenditure on defense and non-defense objectives. A caps deal is to simply set, not necessarily those priorities per se, but to set a top level of discretionary spending. That's why it's called a cap. It's been about a 1.1 or 1.2 trillion. Now it's going to be a little over that this year, I presume, for discretionary spending. Most of the budget, of course, is not discretionary spending. 2/3 of the budget is either mandatory spending or debt payment. But I just want to clarify that we are talking about two separate items. One, a budget, which is a budget plan, which can, in fact, include caps within it, but a caps deal is a separate deal. As the gentleman has pointed out, we've usually made them now for 2 years since the sequester would otherwise have gone into effect. The reason we've made that deal, both sides are unwilling to follow the sequester because we think the sequester does not make rational sense for the security of our country and for the investments our country needs to make. The president doesn't want to do that either. The difference is he wants to borrow an additional $180 billion plus to fund defense and leave domestic discretionary spending largely at 2010 or 29 levels. We think that doesn't make sense. But I will clarify for the gentleman again that the Budget Committee is in fact considering what legislation they should bring to the floor in order to facilitate us, as the caps deals did, to facilitate us achieving the ability to mark up our appropriation bills, send them to the Senate, and try to reach agreement between the Senate and the House prior to September 30th, and certainly to avoid the historic and very harmful shutdown that occurred at the end of the last Congress and continued into this Congress. And I will yield to my friend.
Again, thank the gentleman for yielding back. And as I pointed out earlier, you have two methods in which to set those caps. You can do it through the budget, which 7 of the 8 years we were in the majority we did, or you can do it through a separate caps deal, which 2 years ago we were able to do for a 2-year period, which is why we didn't do a budget last year. We passed it out of committee and at least showed what our priorities are, but we didn't need to pass a budget to get a caps deal because we had a caps deal in place from the prior year. The other 7 years, there was no caps deal, so the budget laid out that number. And the gentleman's majority has done neither. You don't have a caps deal or a budget, and so at some point you're going to have to produce the number to show what we're going to start the appropriations process using. And the other part of the budget, which isn't talked about as much, but is equally important, is the establishment of the priorities for that majority. How do we get back to a balanced federal budget, for example? We laid that out in our budget multiple times. You have programs like Medicare. Medicare is going bankrupt if we do nothing. It would be irresponsible for us to let Medicare go bankrupt. Actual reports show it could go bankrupt in the next 8 years, which we think is irresponsible. That's why we put in our budget a plan to save Medicare from bankruptcy. Whatever the gentleman's plan would be to save Medicare from bankruptcy, I would urge him to show it. Show the American people what the priorities are, but they haven't done that. And why? Why haven't they done that? Because they've spent the last 2 years trying to impeach the president, trying to lay out this foundation that there was collusion with Russia.
Will the gentleman yield?
And the gentleman will yield in a moment, but let's be clear. For the last 2 years, we heard this clarion call that there was some collusion between the president or his family and Russia. We heard all these talks and impeachment and everything on down from the highest levels, including now the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, who went multiple times on national TV and said there was more than credible evidence of collusion. And finally, everybody was waiting on the Mueller report. Many were hanging their hat going, it's going to show all these things. There's going to be lists of indictments. Go look at all the tape from every national TV show you can imagine of some of the most outlandish claims that were made. And now the Mueller report comes out, and it's clear those claims are baseless.
The Mueller report is not out, Mr.
Collusion.
Webb.
There was no collusion.
The gentleman yield?
The Mueller report
is not out.
The
only report that's out is the Barr 4-page letter report.
We will see the full Mueller report. Clearly, we've seen assessments of it. If the gentleman thinks it's going to show something differently, then please share it. But they've made it clear there was no collusion and there will be no further indictments. In fact, the Attorney General of the United States said this: but as noted above, the special counsel did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in these efforts, despite multiple offers from Russian-affiliated individuals to assist the Trump campaign. So multiple times they were offered. They never even came close. There was no collusion. These conspiracy theories, the witch hunts, it's time for it to end. There was no collusion. If you or any of your colleagues have proof of collusion, as your chairman of the Intelligence Committee claims, they need to show that to the Attorney General of the United States, because it completely contradicts what the Attorney General has now said based on the findings of the Mueller report. There was no collusion. And so when Chairman Schiff says, quote, more than circumstantial evidence that he's seen that associates of President Trump colluded with Russia in August, quote, I think there's plenty of evidence of collusion or conspiracy in plain sight. And even now that the Attorney General makes it very clear there was no collusion, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee will not recant his previous statements that have been discounted. And so today, as the gentleman knows, this morning, every member of the minority party on the House Intelligence Committee called for the chairman of the Intelligence Committee to step down. Every member. And so I would ask the gentleman, will you call for the chairman of the Intelligence Committee to step down as chairman after losing so much credibility in the wild and vicious claims that he's made that have been disputed by the Attorney General of the United States based on this Mueller report after 22 months and over $20 million of taxpayer money that found no collusion? And I yield.
What it found is 6 of the president's closest associates, his campaign manager, his deputy campaign manager, his foreign policy advisor, his national security advisor, his lawyer and counsel for over a decade, all committed crimes. All were either convicted or pled
crimes of collusion?
to crimes.
The gentleman yield?
No, I won't. You had a lot to say. I have something in response. There is not a person on our side of the aisle that doesn't believe the letter that you issued regarding Mr. Schiff isn't totally a partisan distraction from what you hope is not found. There has been no Mueller report yet that we have received. The gentleman, Mr. Speaker, voted to have the Mueller report, as did every other member on his side of the aisle and every member on our side of the aisle, to be disclosed. Hopefully it will be. Hopefully it will not be just a 4-page letter from an Attorney General of the United States appointed by Mr. Trump. Hopefully we will get Mr. Mueller's full report. That's what the Congress voted to get. That's what we expect to get, and that's what we hope to get. But let me assure the gentleman, there is not a person on my side of the aisle that believes that Mr. Schiff has done anything but act in the highest interest of our government, of the Intelligence Committee, and of full knowledge for the American people, unlike his predecessor. Unlike his predecessor, who worked hand in glove with the White House, not as an independent, co-equal branch of government, but as an advocate for the White House's position, who clearly should have been removed and was not. So that I want to tell the minority whip, Mr. Schiff is a member of the highest integrity, highest intellect, and great responsibility. I expect him to pursue his responsibilities as chairman of the Intelligence Committee to assure that neither Russia nor any other country will in the future be able to interfere in the elections of the United States, as Mr. Mueller concluded the Russians have. Now, the president hasn't concluded that, but almost every American understands that the Russians tried to, on behalf of the President of the United States, affect the elections. So I tell my friend, I hope that we can have the debate. Let's look at the Mueller report. And very frankly, there are other investigations that are going on, as the gentleman knows, in the Southern District of New York, as well as in the Government Operations Committee, as well as in the Foreign Relations Committee, as well as in the Financial Services Committee, as well as in the Intelligence Committee. we still pale into insignificance in the number of investigations that we have had or oversight hearings that we've had when compared to the oversight hearings you had of the Obama administration and Mrs. Clinton in trying to undermine their credibility. A administration, by the way, that I don't think anybody was put in legal jeopardy, and there were no scandals in the Obama administration. There were disagreements, but I would think the gentleman ought to be very reserved, very frankly, in terms of making conclusions based upon a 4-page letter before we have seen the Mueller report, before we've seen the actions of the Southern District of New York, and before we've seen the results of the oversight hearings that are continuing. I yield.
Well, thank the gentleman for yielding. There are a number of items that need to be addressed in what the gentleman just said. First of all, to claim that there was any collusion, as you said, quote, on behalf of the President of the United States with Russia, goes in complete contradiction to the findings that were delivered to us by the Attorney General of the United States. And I'm going to read it one more time. As we noted above, the special counsel did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. And anyone who would make a claim to the contrary is either being irresponsible or ought to show the evidence. If there's evidence that the chairman of the Intelligence Committee has, and let's be clear, he's tweeted things out. Here is what we know. This is from Chairman Schiff in 2017. Here is what we know. The Russians offered help. The campaign accepted help. The Russians gave help. The president made full use of that help. He's claimed again that he has more than circumstantial evidence that there was collusion. And yet the Attorney General of the United States, after reviewing the entire Mueller report, which I hope we all see, obviously within the confines of the law makes it clear how something like that gets reported. I hope the gentleman understands and wouldn't suggest that classified information should be disclosed, but the report ought to be disclosed and show the American people what they found, but we've seen the summary of it. And of course, we're going to look at the entire thing. And maybe then after reviewing the entire thing, if the gentleman does see, as the report summary shows, that there was no collusion with the President of the United States, then maybe this gentleman and all the other people that have made outrageous claims that the President was in collusion will maybe acknowledge they were wrong, will maybe offer an apology. Who knows? We can hold out hope for that. But let's be clear about the statements that were made and the things that were alluded to that aren't true, that weren't the case. Maybe it was wishful thinking and it shouldn't have been. No one should hope that the President of the United States, any president, conspired with a foreign government. But to suggest it over and over again for 2 years, and then for all of this 22 months of investigation, thorough investigation, multiple countries visited, over $20 million of taxpayer money, more than our committees have to run all of their oversight operations to thoroughly investigate. They found there was no collusion. Sure, the Russians tried to meddle with elections, and they've done it before, and we ought to make sure it doesn't happen again, and we can work together on that. But to suggest the President of the United States colluded when he didn't is irresponsible. And it's happened over and over, and it continues to this day. It's got to stop. This idea that maybe some other attempt to go and harass the president and his family is going to find something else, it gives credence to the claims it was a witch hunt. And it's time for us to focus on the real problems of this country. It's also time for us to hold people in our intelligence agencies accountable who showed up at their job with a partisan agenda. FBI or CIA, any intelligence agency, is no place for you to bring your political agenda. We all have political views. But if you put that badge on and you accept that responsibility, and then you use that position to abuse your power, we all ought to call on it to be rooted out. And I hope it is rooted out. If there were abuses of the FISA process, which is a very important court, has a very narrow focus to protect the national security of this country. If the FISA court was abused by people in positions of power because they wanted to carry out a political agenda, because they didn't like the results of the 2016 presidential election, that's not the place for it. The ballot box next year is the place to go carry it out, not wearing the badge and being a member of law enforcement in this country. And so I hope that's rooted out, because we want to see the integrity of those institutions like the FBI restored. I want the country to have full faith and confidence that the people working there are carrying out the national security interests of the country, not their own political interests. And there are a lot of questions raised over whether or not that happened. But in the end, when we review the report, we've seen the summary. If people are still hoping that there's some mystery indictment out there, they said there are no further indictments. They said there was no collusion with the presidential campaign. And so at what time is your side going to acknowledge it didn't happen? If you want to change the results of the presidential election, the results are changed at the ballot box. That's how we resolve it in America. We don't try to go find something on a president that doesn't exist. We've done oversight. You've done oversight. The Mueller investigation was the ultimate oversight for 22 months, and it rooted out and found there was no collusion between the president and the Russians. And maybe some people are disappointed to hear it. We should all celebrate that as a country. But we all ought to be concerned that no president of the United States is targeted by an intelligence agency or by a Congress or a majority or a minority because they don't like the results of the election, so they're going to abuse power to go and try to take them down. That's not the way we do it. And I hope we can finally focus on the real problems of this country and not continue to use these committees even after they didn't find what they were looking for, to keep finding something that's not there. The former chairman that was alluded to, Mr. Nunes, did a very impeccable job of carrying out his duties to find the facts. It was always about the facts. And if you go and look at how he carried himself and managed his committee, the entire time it was about finding the facts. And they looked, we looked. There was no collusion that we found. If someone has proof of that collusion that they keep alluding to, it's time for them to show it. Show the American people what you have. Don't run around hiding saying you have something when the Attorney General says it's not there. If you know about collusion, you owe it to the country to show it. But if it's not there, stop saying it. It's irresponsible. And hopefully everybody heeds those words and we get back to focusing on what's important for this country. Express our political differences. Obviously, if there's a political difference that we have with each other, with the president, with a cabinet secretary, we have all kind of forums to express that opposition, to correct it, to bring legislation to the floor. But if we just don't like somebody personally, that's not what we're here to do. And I hope we can get beyond that. And I would yield to the gentleman.
Well, I don't think I'll respond to all of that. Time being of the essence, I suppose. The gentleman speaks, represents a party who held 8 hearings, all headed by Republicans, on Mrs. Clinton. All 8 reached the same conclusion. But the first one wasn't enough. The second one wasn't enough. The third one wasn't enough. 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th weren't enough. And so the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy, was appointed to do one more. Because it was pretty close to the election then, Mr. Speaker. And the majority leader, now the minority leader of this House, said, oh no, they accomplished something. They accomplished the political objective. He said that on television, roundly criticized by his party. Why did you say that? Why did you admit that? But for the minority whip to say that the Mueller report instigated X millions of dollars spent for political purposes, Mueller was appointed by a Republican, not by a Democrat. And the Attorney General recused himself so that the Deputy Attorney General, Mr. Rosenstein, was the one who made the appointment. Why did he recuse himself? Because he had been involved, contrary to what he testified to in his nomination hearing, to the Russian ambassador. I don't know whether there was anything substantive in that conversation, because we don't fully know what that conversation was. But the fact of the matter is, for the minority whip to be talking about political hearings or oversight, and then to say he's had an opportunity to review the Mueller report. You've had more than I have, Mr. Webb.
I didn't, for clarification,
he reviewed the Barr letter, 4 pages, appointed by Mr. Trump, And what we know is Barr's reading and his conclusion. But frankly, we knew that before, because he sent a 19-page letter months ago that he thought this investigation would not reach any conclusion, and that it should not, and that the president could not be held accountable in any event. That was Justice Department policy. So I listened to a long discussion. In my view, with all due respect, I tell my friend the whip, at odds with the performance of their administration and the 8 hearings they had in trying to bring Mrs. Clinton down and never finding. Never. 8 hearings, all led by Republicans, to a conclusion that led to anything. So we'll see what the Mueller report says. I hope, and I'm pleased that the whip and his party voted to have the Mueller report fully disclosed. He is correct. There are some national security interests that will properly restrict some of that so we don't outsources or ways and means of discovering information. But having said that, we will have a time, Mr. Whip, to debate this. We'll have a time to debate it when we have the information. We'll have a time to debate it perhaps months from now when all of these investigations are through. But I wouldn't take too much solace in what the Mueller report did. It led to, as I said, the indictment and conviction of the president's campaign manager. It led to the indictment and conviction, either through plea or trial, of 5 other individuals to date. That is not something I think that to be very proud of in terms of the President of the United States being so close to and so involved. Mr. Cohen in particular brings that information forth to a hearing. And he was apparently his closest legal advisor for over a decade. So we'll see. But I don't think now, Mr. Speaker, is the time to debate it, because the time to debate it will be to see when we see, and the American people see, the Mueller report. And yes, I want to say to my friend so he understands, I am pleased that we don't have a finding that the President of the United States colluded, as he said he did not do. Colluded, of course, is not a legal term. It's not conspiracy is the gravamen of or the essence of a criminal activity, a conspiracy to commit something that is illegal. But we have a time to debate that and discuss it. And the American people hopefully are going to have an opportunity to reach their own conclusion, which obviously in the final analysis will be the most important conclusion. But the good news is we're continuing to do the substantive business of the people of the United States. We're continuing to focus on jobs. We had numerous hearings this week on jobs, on wages. We had numerous hearings on health care and the costs of health care and the cost of prescription drugs. We passed one of the most far-reaching reform bills that we've seen on the floor of this House, H.R. 1. Every Democrat voted for it. Almost every Republican voted against it. We've passed just today pay equity. We have passed some rational, reasonable controls on people with criminal records or on the no-fly list or with mental health problems from not getting weapons to hurt a lot of people quickly. We've seen the tragedy here and around the world. So we've done a lot of very substantive legislation in a relatively short time, and very frankly, we would have done more if the Republicans hadn't left the government shut down and repeatedly voted against opening it up for the first month of our session. So, Mr. Speaker, this is obviously about scheduling, and we're going to continue to bring substantive bills to the floor to respond to the needs of the American people. Yes, we can do oversight as well, but that will not preclude us from pursuing, as the majority, the agenda that we think the American people sent us here to Washington and made us the majority to do. And I hope that my Republican friends will join us in that effort and offer substantive amendments when they think there are differences that they have with that legislation, consider those and send them to the Senate, because that's really what the people want us to do. And to the gentleman's observation about impeachment, I know he's been here. I know he's voted on efforts by some to move ahead on impeachment. And surely I know that he knows the overwhelming majority of Democrats voted no. And I know that he must have heard Speaker Pelosi said that we're not pursuing impeachment. We want to focus on the needs of the American people. I'm sure he heard that, Mr. Speaker. But he tends to reference otherwise on that, and I think that's not accurate. And the American people ought to understand that we are pursuing their agenda, their jobs, their health care, the welfare of their families. That's what our duty is, that's what our responsibility is, and that's what we're doing. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. And whether or not there's a ultimate move towards something like impeachment, which I hope wouldn't come, with all the things we know there are, no high crimes or misdemeanors, there's not even collusion. There are still committee chairmen in your own party that are talking about impeachment. It's not something made up. There's leaders in your party talking about it. The chairman of the Judiciary Committee issued more than 80 subpoenas. And again, you can keep looking. Look at the summary of the Mueller report. 2,800 subpoenas, more than 500 search warrants, interviewed approximately 500 witnesses. And so you can talk about people that were indicted that had nothing to do with the collusion, nothing to do with any ties to the president. Maybe somebody had filed a false tax return. Go throw the book at him. Mr. Cohen came and lied to Congress, and he deserves to go to jail for it. What did your majority do? They brought him back as their star witness. A man who was already guilty of lying to Congress came, swore himself in, and likely lied to Congress again. So again, throw the book at him. But in terms of what the basis of the investigation was, it was to find collusion, and they found none. No further indictments, no evidence of collusion. In fact, saw the Trump campaign pushing back at even offers for help. Foreign governments like Russia trying to interfere with our elections clearly happen. Not just Russia, other countries too, and we all ought to be concerned about it. We all ought to make sure that our defenses are as high as we can make them so that they're not able to collude. You've seen companies in America that were taken advantage of during that campaign season, and they've taken corrective actions too, so that Russia can't use social media companies in this nation to try to take advantage of our electoral system. But in terms of collusion with the President of the United States and a foreign government, it didn't happen. If anybody has evidence to the contrary, show it to the American people. Stop alluding behind some cloak and dagger conspiracy theory that it happened, still to this day, when the Mueller investigation concluded it didn't happen. We'll get the full report. I look forward to reviewing it, just as the gentleman from Maryland looks forward to reviewing it, and maybe we'll continue this conversation. But if all of the findings that the Attorney General gave us in his summary are accurate, which I don't discount they will be. I think they will be. I have the highest level of confidence that the Attorney General's summary is accurate. If it's not, clearly we'll be taking that up separately, but if it turns out to be accurate, I think we all ought to celebrate, number one, the fact that there was no collusion, but then move on. And the people that made accusations that turned out to be baseless ought to apologize and recognize there are people's personal lives and integrity that were being questioned. And if it turned out they were wrong in making those accusations, they ought to hold themselves accountable and to a higher standard. And those are the points that I was making. Hopefully,
Well, my friend yield for...
and I'll be happy to yield on that.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask my friend, is he at all concerned that somebody he didn't mention, Mr. Flynn, was in fact indicted and convicted of lying about his relationship with the Russians and his having clients in Europe, in Ukraine, which he failed to disclose. He was appointed to one of the highest offices, the National Security Advisor to the President. And he lied about his relations with the Russians and to law enforcement, which is a crime, and was convicted, and in fact pled. That I understand what Mr. Barr has said in a 4-page letter after some 48 hours of review of all of the documents, all of the evidence that was adduced. None of us really know. I'm not going to make a conclusion until I have an opportunity to review the report. And I hope we'll have a full debate upon that. But I have all of us who are concerned, Republicans and Democrats, about the extraordinary number of people very close to the President, and most importantly, Flynn, who was the National Security Advisor to the President, have convicted of lying to law enforcement, some not paying their taxes, of cheating the American people and all of us by not paying their fair share, what was due. I think that ought to be of concern to all of us. And these weren't just some people. They were the President's campaign chairman. They were one of the President's foreign policies advisors, Mr. Papadopoulos. It was his personal attorney for 10 years as so-called fixer. Did anything he was told or implied to do. We'll all have concern about that, but we ought to also be happy that hopefully, correctly, Mr. Mueller found that we were not in a conspiracy with, I don't know about that, but colluding with, I don't really know what that exactly means. I have a sense, but it's not a legal issue, that the President did not. Because any president that did collude with a foreign government who is clearly not our friend, and indeed, for the most part, our competitor and, yes, enemy, that would be something, I think, of which all of us would be extraordinarily concerned. So I'm glad that Mr. Mueller didn't find that. But to think that, as the President says, this was a whitewash and no problems, when 5 or 6 of your closest allies and friends have been or are about to be sent to jail, that's not something to be happy about. It wasn't that Mueller didn't find wrongdoing. What Mueller didn't find was beyond a shadow of a doubt that there was criminal behavior on which he believed he could act. That's what Barr said. And in fact, Mr. Mueller, in Barr's letter, concluded that the President could not be exonerated or indicted on the basis of obstruction of justice. He made a conclusion that there was not sufficient evidence. We don't know the answer to that question, but Mr. Mueller says he could not find beyond a reasonable doubt and therefore made no assessment as to whether he did or did not. In any event, we need to move on, as I said, Mr. Speaker, with the people's business. Jobs, health care, integrity in government, safety in our neighborhoods, education of our children, the health of our people. And I will tell the the whip, that I look forward to working with him on such an agenda for the people. And I yield back for a final time my time.
Well, I would share the gentleman's concern about addressing those important issues. I will say, for the 5 people that the gentleman referenced, anybody who broke the law ought to be held accountable. But after 500 witnesses interviewed and over 2,800 subpoenas, all looking to find collusion with the Russian government, not one of the people you mentioned had anything to do with colluding with the Russian government. If they made misstatements, if they didn't pay their taxes, after 2,800 subpoenas, then make sure that they're held accountable for the things they did, but don't suggest that it had anything to do with collusion with Russia, because it didn't. And again, go pull 500 names out of the phone book, and if you put the full weight of the United States government in 2,800 subpoenas into looking into 500 random people, I'm sure not one of them will have done anything wrong, and hopefully not. But if they did and it had nothing to do with what you were initially looking for, let's not try to suggest it had anything to do with collusion, because it didn't. We'll see the full report. We look forward to seeing that. Again, hopefully, if the full report shows what we've already seen in the summary, that there was no collusion, then people who have been claiming there was collusion will also hold themselves accountable, maybe apologize, maybe recant, but surely stop continuing any kind of witch hunt and then focus on these important issues like getting our economy even stronger, working with this president to solve big problems, which we have the opportunity to do, to get a real trade agreement with our neighbors, Mexico and Canada, all of whom want to have better trade relationships with us, can help benefit our economy and create more jobs and have fair labor standards, something we have in front of us, an opportunity to do in a bipartisan way. Maybe get a budget agreement so that we can have certainty well before the September 30th deadline how we're going to fund our government in a responsible way, make sure our men and women in uniform don't have to wonder whether or not they're going to get paid while they're deployed in a foreign country. Make sure we can focus on lowering health care costs, immigration reform that can solve some of the big problems on border security and so many other areas. So hopefully we can find agreement on that, and I'm sure in the coming weeks we will on some, if not all, of those issues. And I look forward to working with the gentleman to do that. And I appreciate that while we go back and forth sometimes, we can have a little fun with our hobbies, but we also have big important tasks. And I know that the gentleman carries out his role in the most responsible way to promote the agenda that he thinks is best for this country, as do I. And ideally, we can find a lot of intersection where we can work together to get really good things done for the American people. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.